Again, thank you for joining us. I turn this over to our speakers for today, Vong Ratz, Michael Hutchinson, and Anneliese Singh.
Hey folks, this is Michael, and we want to look at the different competencies and then how we can use those by looking through lifespan issues and also community issues. And given what's going on legislatively around the country right now, probably spend some time looking at that as well. And if I look at the ACA advocacy competencies, those issues fit right into something there. So I'd like to hear just from Vong and Anneliese, and then we can get started. Vong, you're on mute.
I was saying good morning to some folks who are on the West Coast and good afternoon for those on Central Time and Eastern Time and whatever parts of the country or really the world that you may be coming from. My name is Vong Ratz, and I'm an Associate Professor of Counseling at Seattle University. One of the things that we'll be talking about in our discussion today, and it's really a discussion, we didn't prepare a PowerPoint or anything like that, but what we wanted to do was talk about the various competencies related to working with LGBTQ youth in advocacy and social justice, and provide a brief introduction to each of those, and also how we might best utilize those in light of some of the multicultural and social justice issues and initiatives that are happening in our world today. So I'll have Dr. Singh or Anneliese introduce herself. Are you there, Anneliese?
Anneliese has disappeared from my screen, but I don't know if that's just because of my screen or whether it's because she's not here.
Well, what we can do is, I guess, can get started and just kind of talk a little bit about the different competencies that are in the field that likely either inform your teaching as counselor educators or in counselor training programs, or inform your practice in terms of being clinicians or aspiring school counselors or mental health counselors or mental health therapists and whatnot. Michael, did you want to kind of give an overview and talk a little bit about the advocacy competencies?
Right. If we look at the three sets of competencies that we're going to use today, the advocacy competencies, the ACA advocacy competencies, are the oldest of these three, and they were accepted by the American Counseling Association in 2003. And they are looking at three levels of how we do social justice counseling. On the first level, we're talking about working with student and client empowerment. So as we work directly with those people that we would historically identify as our clients, we look at two ways. How do we empower them, and how do we teach them to empower themselves? And I like to speak about changing how we see our clients and begin to see that our clients are just not the people who come to see us directly, but they're also, our clients are the systems within which those people must function. So whether that's a family or a small community. So we then have the responsibility to be advocating for empowerment on that second level. And that means as a counselor, I'm working with the community to advocate for change in the systems. And finally, on the third level, it's looking at how'd that happen? All right. Okay.
I did that while you were talking.
All right. Good for you. you're looking at the public information, social political advocacy. So you're then talking about how do we work to address these issues on a societal level. And specifically, for example, how does the American Counseling Association address issues as we prepare to go to Tennessee for our next conference, given what is going on in Tennessee at this point? So when we're talking about the advocacy competencies, those are the kinds of issues we're talking about. We're also, and if we look then at what the concept of the bullying is in the LGBT community, we want to be looking then at making interventions on all of these different levels. And that's where I'd go with the advocacy competency. Vong, do you want to pick up the other next piece on the social?
I saw that Anneliese was able to join us, and
yes, I was having some trouble with my internet connection, so now I'm joining via my iPhone. So hopefully everyone can hear me.
Did you want to introduce yourself briefly, and then just perhaps talk about the LGBT competencies and kind of give an overview of that?
Sure. My name is Anneliese Singh. I'm at the University of Georgia, and I'm the founder of the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition and the Transgender Resilience Project. In terms of the LGBTQIA competencies in the American Counseling Association, there are two different documents that now guide us in this regard. And one was endorsed by the American Counseling Association in 2010. And so those are now competencies guiding best practices. And then the second document, the counseling competencies for working with LGBTQQIA people, that was endorsed by LGBT, the Association of LGBT Issues in Counseling in 2013. So those are I kind of use the umbrella of queer and trans competencies when I talk about both of these documents. Both documents are set up to talk about training competencies from human growth and development, social and cultural development, helping relationships, group work, professional orientation, career and lifestyle, appraisal and research. So they really follow some of the K-CREP domains. But when you think about, Michael was just taking us through the advocacy competencies and the different dimensions. But the way that you can think about competence in terms of working with queer and trans clients is that you start with a very deep self-reflection of your own gender and sexual orientation, affectional orientation journey. And then you kind of move out into kind of knowing how queer and trans people have been treated by our profession, kind of thinking about issues of privilege and oppression for both us and the client. And then moving into, okay, how does this all work within the things that we do as counselors, whether it's group work, leading groups, working with clients individually, working with partners, in the way that we do research. So I can talk a little bit more about that as we go, but that's kind of an overview of the queer and trans competencies.
Great. And I will talk a little bit about the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies, which are probably the newest in the field, and they were endorsed by the American Counseling Association, the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, and a CERVIC. So various divisions have, up to this point, have endorsed the competencies. And Anneliese and I were fortunate enough to have been selected to serve on the committee to revise the original multicultural counseling competencies, which were developed by Sue Arredondo and McDavis. It was a rather big undertaking, and it took us about a year to really develop the competencies. And so it was a process that required us to kind of do a lot of readings about various competencies, not just in counseling in the field of psychology, but in social work, student affairs, and related professions. And so what we developed is now referred to as the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies, which is an update and revision to the Multicultural Counseling Competencies. We added the term social justice to the title And it was really something that we talked about over the course of time in terms of, would this change the focus too much? And what we wanted to do, and the reason we decided to add social justice to the multicultural counseling competencies, was because this is where we see the field, A, heading, and B, needing to head. And hence the new title, the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies. One of the things about these new competencies that we talked about was, how can we make sure that it's relevant for all clients and all students, and in terms of aspiring counselors and also practicing counselors. And so what we were really getting at was this notion of intersectionalities. The initial multicultural competencies really did a good job of looking at the issues of underrepresented groups, and specifically racial ethnic minorities, and which at the time was relevant and needed because of the social and political landscape at the time. But so much has changed in the world since the initial development of the multicultural counseling competencies in terms of research and practice, and also what's been happening in the field. And that's reflected in our training programs. You look around training programs across the country, you have students from different backgrounds, whereas before that wasn't such the case. And so we wanted to develop competencies that also spoke to students and counselors who were from minority groups, if you will, with respect to race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, economic status, so on and so forth. And so we developed a conceptual framework of the multicultural counseling competencies that kind of looks at people's privileged and marginalized statuses, whether they be counselor and client. And you can see here on this quadrant, it's a privileged counselor working with a marginalized client, privileged counselor working with a privileged client based on shared identity, marginalized counselor working with a privileged client based on shared identity, and then marginalized counselor working with a marginalized client. We kept some aspects of the multicultural counseling competencies. If you look at the old competencies, it really started with counselors first must develop self-awareness. Then they have to have an understanding of client worldview. Then we added the counseling relationship. How does one's self-awareness and client worldview influence the therapeutic relationship between counselor and client? And then we added a component to the counseling process, which is advocacy. One of the things that we see and hope that future counselors will start doing is start as part of their initial assessment of working with client, which is determine whether they need to focus their services in terms of one-on-one office-based interventions or systemic-based environmental interventions to focus on changing the systems. If it's the system that's causing client stress and tension, perhaps the focus should be on changing systems versus changing the person to adapt to the system. So what you see in these new competencies is really a focus on intersectionalities in a way that the initial competencies didn't necessarily address before, and then really focusing on balancing individual counseling with systemic level advocacy efforts. At the core of the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies is multicultural and social justice praxis. And what we're meaning by that is everything that counselors should be doing and counselor educators should be doing should be about promoting multiculturalism and social justice, in whether it's in their training programs or in their work with clients. So this is a conceptual framework of all the competencies that were listed. And these competencies are listed in the ACA website. But if you look at the competencies itself, like bullet 1 of attitudes and belief for counselor awareness, aligns with bullet 1 for client worldview, so on and so forth. So they all sort of build on each other in a developmental sequence, if you will. So.
If we now begin to look at what the issues are for our client population, Anneliese, we're going to talk about some of the issues in childhood and adolescence for LGBTQI whatever clients and the world in which they live.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Vong. Yeah, I think let's go in and just talk about what's going on right now. So if we take, the country that we live in that's now called the United States, right? We've seen, and you may have already talked about this, Michael and Vong, and Carlos at the beginning of the webinar, but in Mississippi, we see the passing of the Religious Liberties Law, signed into law by Mississippi governor. We have the North Carolina law that was just passed a couple of weeks ago that really was restricting bathroom access for transgender people. So when you think about working with queer and trans people in childhood and adolescence, most likely you're working either in a school or in a community setting or with older adults who have children or maybe loved ones who are in this kind of age group. So I think, one of the things that the multicultural and social justice competencies lead us to do is, as Vong was saying, just really look at, as a counselor, what are the shared and different identities that you have that are related to privilege and oppression. So if you're working individually with a client, let's say it's a gender nonconforming youth of color who's in high school who comes in and says that they're being bullied by their peers, then you've got to first have already done the work already about who am I as maybe a cisgender person, what have been my experiences as a cisgender counselor related to my gender privilege, and then maybe what are some of the ways I got beat up around gender. For instance, if you identify as a cisgender woman, maybe there are stereotypes that you've had to labor under, or if you identify as a cisgender man, maybe there are also gender stereotypes that have really affected your life. So as I'm talking, you might be able to hear that now I'm starting to bring in some of the queer and trans competencies, that deep reflection of a gender journey, whereas the multicultural and social justice competencies say, hey, we've got to do this self-reflection. That's that domain Vong talked about with counselor awareness. We do that so we can step into and be attuned to the client's worldview, for instance, as a gender nonconforming youth of color. And then that helps us kind of figure out what do we do in the counseling relationship. So when I think about the clients and students I've been working with after what's happened in Mississippi and North Carolina, what I've noticed, if we kind of make that connection of the personal is political, is all of a sudden, a lot of young people who identify as trans or gender nonconforming are really feeling pretty scared. They're feeling like, wow, is this a safe place for me? Now, as a counselor and someone who has a larger perspective, using the advocacy competencies, I know the history of laws and policies. I know that the Equal Protection Clause is something that will likely be used to strike down some of these laws. They'll likely go to the Supreme Court. That doesn't change what my students and young people are going through right now. So I've got to be able to sit with that fear, maybe talk about, let's say I'm a school counselor, and really be thinking about, okay, do I have good bathroom access for this gender nonconforming young person? Or do I just send them to the faculty bathroom or a bathroom that's separate? Are they able to really use bathrooms, for instance, of their choice? Am I using the pronouns and the name that they use for themselves? Notice I did not say preferred pronouns or preferred name. I think about preferred as I prefer cream in my coffee. I do not have pronouns or names I want you to use for me. I have my name, Anneliese, and my pronouns, she, her, they, their, that I want you to use. So even though that's not in the competencies, let's drop that whole idea of preferred anything when working with trans and queer people. But then I think the advocacy competencies would really help guide me in working with this gender nonconforming young person of color, to really think about what are the interventions I could be engaging in with them, as Michael was talking about, or on behalf. So for instance, with the multicultural and social justice competencies and the advocacy competencies, what are those systemic approaches I can take? Can I initiate comprehensive training for my faculty and staff in my school based on the fact that people are in distress, and we probably should have more of a preventive approach, especially if you're in Mississippi or North Carolina. But maybe sometimes we're in a system where we have to have a reactive approach. But then if you're having that reactive approach, are you able to build that intervention into more preventive approaches? And then are we working with self-advocacy skills with this young person to kind of do role plays and figure out the resources they have in their own life that they might need to really lead a life that's fulfilling and remove some of those barriers? Do they know the type, are they experiencing bullying from administration who won't use their name, or from teachers who won't use their pronoun? Is it coming from peers? Is it happening in the hallway? There are a lot of different things you can do individually, but I think all of these competencies together, I know they can be overwhelming, but I feel like once you know the advocacy and the social justice, multicultural competencies really well, then I feel like it starts to click in. Okay, the queer and trans competencies, you start with that deep self-exploration, and then you move through all these dimensions of what we do, how we lead groups, how we do assessment, how we do one-on-one work, so that you're kind of leveling the playing field between you and your client, where you can actually serve them and help them lead a life that is not just addressing the bullying, but reminding them about how important they are as a queer or trans young person, how important their voice is, and how there are people like them. I'm not a big fan of the Dan Savage "it gets better" kind of movement, but really figuring out as a counselor, how can we make it better for these queer and trans young people in our lives? And I think one thing that is particularly in the queer and trans competencies that sometimes gets overlooked is that I think the competencies ask us as counselors to really know our history, our her story, and our T stories, as in transgender stories. So for instance, being queer or trans, it isn't a fad, it isn't a trend, it isn't new. It's actually queer and trans people have existed across time, continent, and culture for hundreds and thousands of years. And so why don't we have those stories, for instance, of the Hijra, the transgender people in India, the queer people, the Mahu of Hawaii and the Pacific Islands? We don't have those stories, mostly because of colonization and more puritanical notions of how gender and sexual or affectional orientation norms should be expressed. So I feel like this is an understudied and an under-talked about area of counselor advocacy when it comes to working individually and systemically with clients, because we get trapped into thinking, oh, this is a religion versus queer and trans thing, as opposed to, hey, this is a colonization thing, and how did we have these identities a while back where they were more affirmed and considered even sacred? In the country that we now call the United States, there are a lot of two-spirit people and people who held kind of the sacred rituals of various indigenous tribes. So I think that's kind of how I might start to think about working with a young person in childhood and adolescence. And Vong, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about being a young adult and an adult in general.
Sure. And I'm going to do a screen share. And talk about working with LGBTQ young adults, and you know, it's a broad group, and so I don't want to overgeneralize and things of that nature. But there's workplace issues that LGBTQ adults deal with, personal life issues related to marriage equality, so on and so forth. I think when you think about the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies, I think it's easy to initially, when you work with an LGBTQ young adult, to focus on their sexual orientation or one's gender identity. And what the new competencies really talk about is intersectionalities, which is really looking at the whole gamut that makes up that person's identity. I think part of the initial process of initially working with a student is really, or a client, if you will, is really identifying the different marginalized and privileged statuses that a person possesses, and that they may or may not necessarily be aware of, as well as one's own marginalized and privileged status in society, and really exploring with clients how they might benefit from privilege, or how might they be at a disadvantage because of one's marginalized status. So I think part of the initial process of working with clients is being able to identify those things from the outset, with and alongside with clients, and as well as with oneself. And I think that's important because that can help shape and determine kind of what tends to be prevalent in the therapeutic relationship between counselor and client. For example, working with a LGBTQ client, you might view yourself as being on this quadrant in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, if you're a heterosexual counselor. But if you look at other identity variables, you might be on this quadrant if you both identified with being white, for example. Or you might be on this quadrant if you were female and the client you're working with were male. Or you might be on quadrant 4. I don't know if you can see the arrow when I move it around. You might both be members of oppressed groups because of your religious orientation or status, if you will. And so the gist behind all this is really that identity is this fluid process that's not always static, and that this is always playing out with the various clients that you work with. And so in one minute you might be in quadrant 1, and the next moment you might be on quadrant 2 in terms of your interaction with a client. To make things even more complex, the client might come in thinking, we're on this quadrant, and you're thinking, we're on this quadrant, right? Because that's what's salient for you in your interaction. This is what's salient for the client in that interaction, or in your interaction. So I think when you're working with LGBTQ clients who are identified as young adults, it's really being cognizant of the different shared and unshared identities that influence, that one, make you who you are, and then 2, influence the counseling relationship. I think the other thing that's really important to note in the new competencies is determining whether interventions need to be one-on-one or systemically based. And so what we created, or not created, but what we took was parts of the socio-ecological model. And so one of the things that we're hoping, and then what we added was an international global perspective, because the international global affairs affect clients as well, whether they be directly or indirectly. And we see that through politics, we see that through wars, we see that through immigration patterns that occur in this country, so on and so forth. So we added the international global perspective as something counselors and clients should look at together. But hopefully what counselors will start doing is looking at these different spheres of influences, if you will, that are influencing the client. So it's looking at the client at an interpersonal level. What personal values, beliefs, biases do they hold that shape their values and beliefs, and how do their identities and statuses, identities in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, so forth, and statuses in terms of being a member of a privileged or a marginalized group, influence those values and beliefs. What interpersonal factors influence that client's presenting concerns, whether directly or indirectly? Who might be sources of support for that person in terms of family, friends, peers, so on and so forth? How might institutional factors influence the client directly or indirectly, whether it's schools, churches, communities, businesses, so on and so forth? What might the values that are embedded in a community be that influence that client? The norms around sexual orientation, the norms around race, the values around social class status. What might those be that may be influencing a client, whether in appropriate ways or inappropriate ways? And then public policy looks at what policy are in place that might be influencing that clients, whether they be positive or negative, and or what policy should be implemented that could help that client at the individual or systemic level, and then also what global issues might be impacting, whether that it be that client or that client's family. And so one of the things that the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies really start encouraging people to do is look at clients not just as individuals, but look at them in terms of within the context of their environment. And so really, it's hopefully asking counselors to really step out of their shells, if you will, and look at client issues more contextually. And the idea behind the socio-ecological model is, and looking at things more contextually, is that hopefully it will lead counselors, whether they be in school, mental health settings, or private practice settings, to intervene in those different levels. And so, for example, if one's work with a client leads one to believe that public policy issues are impacting the client in negative ways, counselors would intervene at the public policy level. Or if they find that perhaps within the institution, it's things happening at the workplace or in the school, counselors were to intervene in the school or in the workplace. And so what that means is theoretically, you can start a session one-on-one within your office, identifying these factors, and then later on down the line, you might be working alongside or on behalf of a client outside of a session the following week, and then the week after that, coming back and meeting with a client and talking with them one-on-one and processing how that went when you were out in the community working in collaboration. And you know, all of this is not new. There's a field called social work that does community-based work, you know. And the thing about social work that they've realized is also that clinical level one-on-one work is really important. And so you see social workers doing individual-based and community level work because they realize it's a need. That's what their clients are needing. That's kind of what we're wanting people to really ask first and foremost is, what does this person need from me? You know, not necessarily do they need to see a social worker or a psychologist or a therapist, but what is it that they need from me? It might mean one-on-one work, it might mean systemic level work, or more than likely, it might mean a combination of both. What that means, and we also recognize this, is that what we're saying is really different from how the systems have been set up, whether they be in schools or community agencies or private practice settings. And so part of the challenge of implementing the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies is also meaning, part of the challenge means also changing the very systems in which we've created and developed. And I think sometimes when you think about changing systems in which that we've developed, that can be an overwhelming and daunting task. And what we ask people to do is focus solely on those things within their own sphere of influence. In other words, focus on things within your own workplace, your own work environment that would allow you to implement the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies in very meaningful ways for your clients. Focus at the local level, focus at the state level, and at the federal and national levels, and so on and so forth. I think if you focus on what you can control, it makes that feeling of overwhelmingness perhaps less overwhelming. But this is a new way of practicing, and I think the only way this will become implemented is if new counselors or counselors who are currently in the field integrate that in terms of their own field. I think it requires those who train and supervise counselors to start integrating that in their training programs. And it also requires training for ourselves in terms of how do we implement this in our practice. It's very similar to, I think, when the initial multicultural counseling competencies were developed. You had educators, psychologists, therapists who were training about multicultural competence who didn't receive multicultural competence training themselves, right? And this is the same, I think, in the sense of we have a new set of competencies that various ACA divisions as well as ACA has endorsed, and we ourselves haven't necessarily been fully trained on it. And so it's a process of being and becoming, in the sense of learning how to push the field where we feel it needs to head, while also at the same time receiving training ourselves in terms of what's needed. And I think that training not just comes from the universities, but they come from the community, you know, in terms of we have a lot to learn about what the community can teach us about helping and what will work. So when I think about working with LGBTQ adults and how to apply it, I think we talk about intersectionalities, and I think we look at issues from a contextual framework, if you will. And then Michael is going to talk about working with elders with use of the advocacy competencies.
And I want to just speak to that. I'm a practitioner. I am not a counselor educator. And so much of this comes down for me to what I see going on for myself as someone who has recently retired as a result of some medical complications, and the clients that I have been seeing who are moving out of the workforce and into what we're calling retirement. And some of the issues associated with those transitions and the difficulties for those people, many of whom have defined who they were by what their careers have looked like. And if I look at what's going on in the about to retire and older age group, I see a group of people who remember Stonewall and remember the transition away from the lifestyles that occurred before all of the shifting cultural norms. Many of the people with whom I work are men who were sexually active in the 1980s and who have lost many of their closest friends, lovers, partners, and others to HIV/AIDS. So the support systems that might have otherwise been there are not there for them. Now, there's another interesting dynamic that has gone on with the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, and that in many ways brought the male and female communities together. If you look back at some of the history, the men's community and the women's community often developed separately, but when AIDS came in, it was the women who came in to help support in the HIV/AIDS crisis, and that developed the whole concept of a shared community. I look at what happens in Tucson, and in Tucson we have an organization called Senior Pride, which is very closely tied into the Pima Counseling. Pima County is the county in which Tucson is located, the Pima Council on Aging. So there is that network of people that are available to provide services if people know about that. So as a counselor, much of what I am doing when I'm working on all levels is helping people make those connections. There's another important component in this older population that is reinforced by what's going on culturally in our country right now, and that is there tends to be a great deal of fear as people look at what am I going to be doing in the last years of my life. And if I have not developed that network prior to moving into this, where do I go? How do I go there? What does that begin to look like? So if I look at using the competencies, I'm involved in, for example, doing a support group through Pima Counseling on Aging. So we get people to do their storytelling and their sharing, and also helping people make those connections. Vong talked about the social workers. It's kind of like, as a counselor, I come from the intra and interpersonal and recognize, hey, we need to be doing the systemic things as well. Because if I am an elderly woman who no longer has the network that I thought I might have had, where do I go? And so the issues around adulthood or the later adulthood, you run into things like anxiety and depression and the inability to do things that you once could do. And who do I get to share those stories with? It's interesting. I find that even at the ACA conference in Montreal, I had promised myself that when I had gotten older, I was not going to talk about health. And with all of my colleagues in my same age group, we talked about our health. And it was really helpful to do that. So acknowledging that the developmental stages are going to bring about those things that we thought we would never do. And that's, yeah. Do you want to open this for questions or comments?
Yeah.
I think that would be a good idea. I mean, I think, you know, we've talked about kind of the lifespan and some of the evolution of the profession with the different competencies, and kind of you heard with each of us how they might intersect in different ways, but we know it's complicated. We know some of the competencies are new. We do feel like having cultural humility is a part of this work, being very aware that we have growing edges and strengths, but we would love to open it up to attendee questions and feedback as well.
If people don't have any specific questions, should we begin to address what we need to be doing as we see the spread of fear and the passing of legislation that impacts certainly me and all of the people I know in my network? I know, for example, that ACA is going to Nashville next year. Tennessee is one of those states where it is dangerous to be an LGBTQI person. And as we go there, how do we present ourselves? Ideas?
Well, again, I think Carlos might be monitoring if we have.
I just wanted to ask you about,
Okay.
Can we talk a little bit about the bullying aspect? And in terms of your question about Nashville, I think we should go as advocates, and we should publicly speak about these issues of what they're doing in terms of institutional policies and legal mandates, etc.
Yeah, Farah, if we just take the legislation itself, that is a form of bullying. What I'm looking at is that those behaviors which instill fear and do not encourage me to be who I am has that impact of bullying on me. So I really believe that as we look at these issues, the concept of bullying comes down to, does it trigger fear? And when I am afraid, I become immobilized. So being able to share this story, I know that ACA has been taking an active role in testifying in Tennessee, but I think we need to do more than that. It seems to me that as an association or as a group, as we prepare to present programs in Nashville, that those programs really look at how do we do community involvement kinds of things. How do we have a presence there that says we want to change what is going on? We want to make this community a safer place.
I agree with Michael. I mean, the classic definition of bullying, my research is in some of this area with queer and trans young people, is that there's kind of a power differential between the person who experiences kind of that harassment, everything from violence to verbal, physical, sometimes sexual harassment. And we know those numbers are high, especially for queer and trans young people. But that it's persistent. So the legislation does qualify for bullying, but I think as Michael was talking about that culture of fear, and as we think about heading to Nashville and what we can do in our settings, we've got counseling programs that are in North Carolina and Mississippi, and we can be working with students, practitioners can be working with one another across disciplines to write letters to queer and trans organizations that are doing the work, that need encouragement, that say, hey, we're with you. We can sign petitions. But again, I bring us back to the queer and trans competencies and the new multicultural and social justice competencies. We can't do this advocacy change if we haven't done a lot of self-examination of who we are. And I think the multicultural and social justice competencies are kind of set up to do that, what is our connection to why we want to do advocacy with queer and trans groups? If you're cisgender, how's your liberation connected to transgender people? I talked about that earlier. All of us get kind of messed up around gender. So let's not do our advocacy, whether it's within a session or outside of a session, with people or on behalf of them, just for them. Let's do it for our own humanity. And, there's kind of some ableist language around bullying, because people will typically talk about the bystanders and the upstanders, right? But I think the way we can really look to the ally competencies within the LGBTQQIA competencies that talk about what do allies experience when they're doing this work, whether it's you're the school counselor telling a queer young person that they're good and you're the only person they're hearing that from, and you're afraid what's going to happen in working with their parents or what's going on with teachers, or whether you're working with someone who is in hospice care or, an assisted living facility where a lot of queer and trans people feel like they have to kind of go back into the closet. So I think that, bullying is a good overall way to think of these issues. But we've just got to remember that we've got the kind of individual interventions, but we've got these systemic interventions too. And how do we want to be a part of changing the culture, right? I mean, Vong was talking about how there's going to be this gap in who's trained under the older and newer competencies with multiculturalism and social justice. And I think often students, new practitioners feel like, well, what can I really do? And it's, I think all of these competencies turn those issues, those questions of power and privilege on it kind of flips them in a way and says, actually, how do we use the power that we have, and how do we stop saying that we don't have the power to do the work we need to do? Because not only do other people's lives depend on it, queer and trans young people attempt suicide at the highest rate for the age group of 15 to 24. We've got to do it for them, but we've also got to do it for our own humanity, so we can live with ourselves and have a good consciousness of where we want to go. And I think counselors, we have been and we can continue to be leaders in these issues. So I'm going to, I don't know, Vong, if you have anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I just realized there was a whole chat going on during this whole time. I'm just reading it and catching up with it while you and Michael were talking. I think in response to Michael's question about Tennessee and ACA being at Tennessee, and I look at the new competencies, we can intervene at various levels. I think, what we're talking about is a public policy issue, and I think we can learn a lot from business. When I say we, I'm talking about ACA. If PayPal can opt out of being in North Carolina, we can opt out of being in Tennessee. So as an organization, we can take an organizational stance and say we're going to hold our conference somewhere else. I think that gives weight to the words that we're talking about. I think that influences policymakers, at that institutional level. So when I think about what ACA can do, I think about that. I think, and it really has to go to how deep of an issue is it for you? How much do you care about it? I think at an individual level, people can personally and professionally opt out. I'm not going to attend, right? Or I'll attend, but I'm going to stay up in Kentucky or something like that, drive down for the day, right? And pack a lunch and make sure I don't utilize any of my financial resources to contribute to the state. But I think if you don't attend, let people know about it, right? Email the mayor, email the legislatures to say, I wanted to go to this, but I'm not, and for this reason, right? And so being out in your advocacy efforts, I think is important. I think you can partner with your divisions within ACA to address some of the things that are happening in Tennessee. I think taking peaceful walkouts and stances is something that can certainly be done to address some of the things in Tennessee. But I think ACA has, an opportunity to take leadership on what they want to do. And the good thing is it's not happening tomorrow. It's a year from now, and so that provides time to really be methodical in terms of what they intend to do.
I'd like to respond to that as well. I know I had this discussion about not going to Tennessee with Catherine Rowland, the incoming ACA president. ACA is going to go to Tennessee. And my response was, if the association is going to go there, then how are we going to have a very solid presence? Now, back in the mid-90s, the ACA Human Rights Committee, which at that time was much more powerful than it is right now, sent a resolution to Governing Council which said that ACA would not have its conference in a site that had policies, practices, and procedures that violated ACA's anti-discrimination code, and that the ACA staff would work with the Human Rights Committee in selecting sites for the conference. That actually occurred for 2 or 3 years and probably has not been done in a while. So, but that policy is on the somewhere ACA. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, Michael, there's a little bit of an echo. I think it's interesting that we're going to go. I saw Lance Smith is on this webinar, and I just want to alert everyone that he's a wonderful scholar, and there's going to be a special section of JCB, I believe in the fall, where he has an article coming out really calling out some of the programs, counseling programs in our field that have these anti-queer and trans policies. And there's going to be a response to that. And then Lance was able to write a response to that as well. So we've got a couple of different ways to, well, more than a couple, to kind of really use this as an opportunity to take the next step. The queer and trans competencies were endorsed by ACA and LGBT in 2010 and 2013. And I always run into people that don't know them. So how can we, if you're a student, say, hey, supervisor, I want to talk about these. If you're a practitioner, kind of getting together with a peer support group and saying, let's talk about how this interfaces with our work. And I know just from seeing the Black Lives Matter and some of the movement and some of the ways they've used social media and really intersectional ways of doing their work, is to really see this kind of movement, not just as just a queer and trans thing, but how do we talk about larger issues of sexism within counseling, ways that patriarchy still kind of affects our field. And even though there are more people that identify as probably cisgender women than ever. You know, how do these show up in our training programs to just think about things really, really broadly from a justice and human rights perspective? So I do feel like Catherine Rowland has made some pretty direct statements about Nashville and ACA, but you know, there may be a need for people who do decide to go to wear t-shirts or just, you know, have some ways of kind of protesting, not just kind of with voice, but, you know, being visible as well. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this goes, because I see it as a really opportunity to say, this is where our field is now, and now we've got to take the next step that is really sustainable.
And if we put this in the context of bullying, this is, I would say, if you look at what the Nashville or the Tennessee legislation is, this is bullying of counselors. They are telling us that we have to essentially violate our code of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to encourage my clients and the other people in my community to take a stand, then I need to be doing that as well. And I need to be doing that with colleagues. I frequently work with people saying, it's one thing to do it by yourself, and if I look at the aging issue, that gets to be very lonely. And part of the way I can address the bullying that occurs toward older adults is to help them find a shared cause. And this would be one of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I saw a comment.
I want to respond to Adrian had a question about if we choose to go, can we, as a large group, take a stand? I think we have to. I think we need to submit programs that very directly address this. I think there was a time when ACA actually went out and did workshops in the communities where we held the conferences. I think perhaps going back to doing something like that, where we actually collaborate with LGBTQI organizations within the community and with maybe communities of faith, and that we go in, and we go in with that cultural humility. We go in as students of what is this community like, and what can we learn from you that we can take back to wherever it is we go. Fong, are you talking? Your microphone is off.
Well, I said it was really good too.
Okay, I'm sure.
No, I was saying, to kind of go along what you were saying, Michael, and that's one of the things that ACA does with leaders who are in ACA and its divisions is they have a workshop or conference. I forget what it's called, but part of that experience is going to the Capitol building and meeting legislatures in that state. And I think that's one of the venues, in terms of responding to Adrian's posting. One of the things that ACA can be intentional about is going there and advocating and fighting against this policy and making it well known. There's a venue for it. It's just a matter of ACA taking that position and doing it. But what I wanted to say earlier, and I think what you, Michael and Anneliese are talking about, is really the need for counselors to not be value neutral in this cause, in this issue. And that's really counter to what the whole profession or the myth about this profession is about, is counselors need to be value neutral. And so it's going to likely make people feel uncomfortable, but that's okay, right? Because these policies aren't value neutral. They're very subjective, and so they require subjective, value-laden interventions, if you will. And it's really about promoting a more just world for everyone, I think. And so I think part of it is overcoming that notion that we need to be value neutral. We need to kind of be neutral in our response. And I think if we do that, we're going to get run over, and the people that hurt the most is our clients. The people that lose out the most is our clients. So when I hear you talking about some of the things that you're both talking about, you're really talking about what Katz said in 1980 is counseling should not and is not a value neutral process.
Mm-hmm. I love that you shared that, Vong. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is Audre Lorde's quote, we have to consciously study how to be tender with each other until it becomes a habit. And, I think when she was talking about that tenderness, yes, it's with one another as we're doing the work of social justice and multiculturalism, not being value neutral, as Vong was saying, but it's also, sometimes the choir needs practice and we feel like we're preaching to the choir, but we need practice. We need to get better and better at this and keep having that vision of what we want the world to look like. We know, and we sit with people who get hurt, whether it's emotionally, physically, sexually, spiritually, etc. And so we've got a lot of expertise to bring to the topic of bullying and hate and pain. So I would just remind us all that for the times we feel overwhelmed, we got this. If we're reading the competencies, if we have the support, if we're doing that deep self-reflection and accountability, we can and will change this. It's the only thing that's ever really changed anything in our society. And to me, that is very exciting, and that's what I want to be a part of. So, Carlos, I know we're at 3:04 and we're a bit over, so I wanted to check in with you about.
We're good to continue if you all want to continue asking questions or fielding any questions. I saw there was a few others in the chat box that folks may be interested in getting at. There was one particularly for you, Dr. Singh, that asked if you could elaborate on the difference in reference to preferred pronouns.
Sure. I think that if you look back over time, I think with sexual and affectional orientation, there used to be well-meaning allied counselors would talk about maybe a lifestyle or a sexual preference, right? And then what we realized is that, number one, that's not great language. Number two, like these identities aren't preferences and they're not a lifestyle. When I think about a lifestyle, I do yoga. That's part of my lifestyle, not kind of who I partner with or who I love. And it's been very interesting in our work as cisgender people with trans people and with trans people themselves. Kind of, I think they have been under so much oppression for so long that it's like, hey, I want you to use my preferred pronouns, right? And because I work so deeply in queer and trans communities, we've just had really important discussions about deconstructing that language of preference and how interesting it is that it's kind of snuck its way back in our movement. So when I said my preference is I prefer cream in my coffee, what I mean is that, I actually identify as a genderqueer person personally myself, and that's a gender identity. So the pronouns I want people to use when they refer to me are she, her, they, their. Those are pronouns I want to hear. They're not pronouns I prefer to hear. And I have a name I want people to use. It's Anneliese. I don't have a name I prefer people to use. So it's really kind of a deconstruction of language, but it becomes really important because I think as counselors, we have to use our privilege to say to our trans clients, okay, my name's Anneliese. The pronouns I use are she, her, they, their. What is the name and what are the pronouns you want me to use when I'm working with you? Because as soon as we do that, whether we're working with cisgender or trans people, it starts to signal something about the counseling environment and how safe it may or may not be. And because queer and trans people regularly get bullied by counselors within the mental health profession, that becomes really important, the small acts of language that we use. And there are some highfalutin, language scholars like Foucault and Freire and Bourdieu and all these folks who have talked about the importance of language related to social justice within education mostly. But in counseling, we care about the actual practice of language so that we make our environments more accessible. And that's just one example of that. And the trans and queer competencies give some other guidance as to language and what folks should be doing. So I hope that answers that question.
I was just reflecting on something.
Also have time for one or two more questions if folks want to either speak up or use the chat. We'll give folks a couple of seconds to respond. If not, I think it would be great just to at least have you folks give us some closing thoughts. All right, that seems to be it in terms of the questions we have lined up. I'd love to have the panelists take an opportunity to just share a closing thought.
Well, Carlos, a couple of people have asked about continuing ed. How do they get their continuing ed unit? Does anybody have the answer to that question?
I'm sorry, I really do not know that information. My job was just to host the webinar.
I think we're supposed to email Dr. Chris Goodrich, LGBT president, and I believe that information is on ACA Connect that Katharina Chang, AMCD president, posted today.
I'd like to do a quick summary, and that is that I work with clients who often are operating from fear, and this fear is often the result of bullying. As I think about taking some of the social action, say in Tennessee, I'm also aware that I get afraid as well. And I want to acknowledge and honor that fear, and I don't want that to be the place from which I make my decisions. And that the key for me to creating change is to operate from love and respect. So if I can reach beneath my fears to the love and respect that connects communities, that's the path that I wish to take, and invite others to do the same.
I would just say it is scary, as Michael was saying, and I saw the comment from someone who was very disturbed by what we're seeing with counselors in Tennessee. But we're kind of in late stage capitalism, folks, and we see that quite a bit. So go read about that. But I think what we've seen is that history can repeat itself in terms of hate or quote unquote victimization, or kind of which group is next in terms of receiving bullying. But I think we've just got to protect that justice flame in our hearts, and just remember we really can. We can do this, and we won't do this, and we have. Vong said earlier, this isn't a new thing. These are the roots of our profession. And when we see these things pop up, I'm actually glad to see them because it gives us something to work with. So I think Dr. King talked quite a bit about kind of having a long-eyed view of justice, that long arc of justice. So in some ways, I don't want folks to get distracted by what's going on. But I also want us to be accountable to what's going on. So I want both things. And I just love our counseling profession. We got this. And let's do this.
I echo the comments made by my colleagues, Michael and Anneliese. And I think for me, it's just, I think we need to be more intersectional in our approach. I think we need to be more contextual in our approach in interventions. So for me, what that means is knowing when and how to balance individual counseling with systemic advocacy with clients. That really means changing the system in which we operate. Sometimes when you change systems, you tend to be unpopular, right? And embracing that and being okay with that. I think there's three types of counselors in this field and in this world. There's counselors who make things happen. There's counselors who wait for things to happen, and then there's counselors who have no clue what's happening. My hope is that you're going to be that counselor or counselor educator and trainer or supervisor that makes things happen. And oftentimes that means having the foresight, the insight and the foresight to take initiative and stuff. So we appreciate your time and in being here. Hopefully you found this meaningful. I certainly did in terms of hearing from my peers in terms of some of the things that they've shared. I always feel like I learn a lot when I interact with Anneliese and Michael in terms of their knowledge and skill base. So I'm very appreciative of this opportunity. Thank you very much for being here.